Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And man, this week it feels like I'm either in pure retro territory or with pop that just gave me way too much to say. Sometimes both at once, and that's not even counting in on the experimental material that's kind of tough to contextualize. Ugh, look, whatever. I'm behind schedule enough as it is. Let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first start off with, from Amy Shark, Cry Forever.
Same for us. Nothing could explain by the way it hurts so much, but at the same time it's
You know, my experience with Australian acts is that they often take an off-kilter or raw approach to sounds otherwise in the mainstream, even in pop, not just making a rote copy of what's already popular. Meanwhile, on her debut album, Amy Shark seemed like a budget version of Taylor Swift by way of Lorde and the most bargain-barrel trap pop, and winds up being utterly forgettable as a result, so I had zero expectations about this sophomore album, and, well, you know, given that this has gotten no votes the past couple of weeks, and little attention elsewhere, I would be in the clear to veto this unless I actually liked it. And I actually kind of think I do. Believe me, I'm about as shocked as anyone, because this is just as derivative of Taylor Swift's early 2010s pop material as ever, but with a more contemporary sheen. But in comparison with how small scale and rather clunky Amy Shark's debut felt, in its best moments, Cry Forever is at least trying to project its quaking angst into a much bigger palette, which is a natural fit for her throatier vocal range. There's definitely a lot of overexposed vulnerability here, but where someone like Julia Michaels would swaddle it in delicate, self-flagellating submissiveness, Amy Shark is trying for something that's a little bit more raw, where the struggle does feel a little bit more tangible, be it as a breakup for which she is clearly not over even if he is, or the larger music industry where she feels like she was getting eaten alive, because that is what happens to way too many pop starlets, especially the ones on the major labels who don't nab the immediate chart success. What gets kind of interesting here is when Amy Shark juxtaposes this pain with her more reckless impulses on songs like Miss You and That Girl and Lonely Still, and especially Baby Steps, and that probably has the best groove on the entire album, or even some of the very obvious co-writes from Ed Sheeran and Dan Wilson on Love Songs Ain't For Us, or You'll Never Meet Anyone Like Me Again, where her passion doesn't really fit into an easy narrative. How much of this is acting out of pain versus her own questionable judgment, or on some level, how much does it even matter if it's therapeutic or just what she needs right now? That being said, while I like for the most part the production is playing to the more lonely but cinematic scope that can actually match Amy Shark's intensity and pipes, and I'm kind of a sucker for that, but outside of some solid melodic fundamentals, some good hooks, and the willingness to sound a little more jagged, I'm not sure the production choices give her that much to work with that really stands out. Faded guitars, more emphasis on clunky percussion than solid groove, a lot of reverb. This would have played a lot more effectively in 2014 or 2015 in the mainstream, but in 2021 it does feel a little overplayed, kind of derivative. And when there's a wave of pop acts who are embracing a lot more raw edges, look, we'll get to a few of them, this is playing it a little safe. But it is still a pretty good pop album. It's not exceptional, but the very best songs push this to an extremely light 7 out of 10. I'll stick up for this. You're curious? Give it a chance. Next up from Aly and AJ, A Touch of the Beat gets you up on your feet, gets you out, and then into the sun.
pull us away from where the pain is.
Really? Seriously, people care about this? Okay, for those of you who don't remember, Aly and AJ were a pop-rock duo from the 2000s that got signed to Hollywood Records, put out a couple albums that apparently moved a lot of units thanks to being adjacent to the Christian music subculture and Radio Disney, and that I was just too old to be in their orbit given that they didn't really have much in the way of charting hits, especially in Canada. And going back to them now, look, if you grew up in this era of pop rock, this sound and presentation was dime a dozen, even for someone who liked that sound, and Hollywood Records' overproduction has dated it pretty badly. So after their second album of original material went electro rock, and then it underperformed, and then they wound up in development hell for the third album, they changed their name, left the label, changed it back, and they've really struggled to assemble a full project for over a decade now. Yeah, there's been a few scattered EP compilations in the past couple of years, but they haven't really attracted much attention outside of the nostalgic diehards. But apparently their focus this time around, it wouldn't even be touching on the 80s inspired sounds that drove those, but much more of a retro 60s and 70s approach, which just so happens to be very conveniently fitting close to the retro soft rock that's been slipping into the mainstream the past couple of years. I see what you're doing, and that's pretty much all of what this is. I mean, seriously, if you imagine an Aly AJ pop record, but with a sound somewhere between Lana Del Rey, Pearl Charles, and Jessie Ware backing them up, that is what this is. Now, I will say, I tend to like this brand of retro 70s soft rock with touches of disco on a very textural level, but also being pretty damn intimately familiar with the original article and the acts that are doing it better in this lane means I know exactly when it's underwhelming or undercooked, because if this approach doesn't have great production or delivery or writing, it can get very boring very fast. And for as pretty as some of these harmonies are, it's hard to ignore how a lot of these hooks are just okay, or how the duo is taking some shortcuts in their production with a lot more reverb, some clumsy mixing, and not nearly the warmth you would expect for this sort of windswept Bakersfield sound, especially when they brush up against soul or psychedelia. Their producer Yves Rothman, he's competent, but he doesn't exactly have a lot of credits, with the most known work being with the Overcoats or playing synth on the last Yves Tumor album. Or you know what, how despite the very winsome vibe of the project, the actual poetry is pretty basic and doesn't really do much to elevate the vibe over an album that runs a fair bit longer than it should. This is a project that is leaning really hard on its atmosphere and its sense of glamour, but that means that Aly and AJ are more riding the vibe than centering it, which leads to an admittedly very pretty album, but feeling listless and undercooked and really quite forgettable. And given that they're now indie, it kind of sucks to say that, even if it does lead to a few nifty moments like that misty guitar lick on Lucky to Get Him, or the out of nowhere late 90s dance rock jam Listen. And you know what this album reminds me a lot more of is that independent Echo Smith album that dropped early last year. Not that much that's wrong with it, it's generally pleasant, the fans will love it, but it was also clear what label polish and a focused approach did for acts that were not very interesting otherwise. Light 6 out of 10. That feels generous. Just saying. Next up from Chloe Moriondo, Blood Bunny.
You can't control me 'cause I wrote this story.
So last time when I reviewed Dodie and highlighted the influx of restrained, primarily acoustic folk pop that gets a lot of hype, but which I've heard so much of it doesn't really impress me, Chloe Moriondo was more of what I had in mind. Her 2018 debut album was fine. You can tell she wanted the writing to carry the heavy lifting, but I wasn't really all that impressed. So hearing that her follow-up was going more in a pop punk or a rock direction, that was a bit of a swerve, although not really surprising given that this is her first album on Elektra, a major label. And after listening to this, the first thing I want to clarify right out of the gate, this is more just in the lane of 2000s pop rock. In this case with some parallels to Ashlee Simpson, Hilary Duff, Brie Larson, or even that Tegan and Sara album from 2019 that is still way better than it actually got credit. Now, I mentioned this before, I tend to be a sucker for this sort of sound. I grew up with it, I appreciate the nostalgia, I remember the acts that pulled it off pretty well, and that's kind of where Chloe Moriondo skids off the rails. Cause even in comparison with the slicker sounds from the acts I described, this is a woefully underpowered album. Not only is she a pretty underwhelming singer, Avril Lavigne or Pink she is not in terms of raw power, it's also the reason the punk comparison doesn't really work. The guitars have nowhere close to the consistent presence or power to back her up, with the drums nearly always carrying more texture and presence in the mix than the riffs, which leaves a lot of the lead melodies struggling to smash on through. But again, that might not always be the point, as this is a project where each individual producer behind her puts a very noticeable stamp on the sound. David Promnick's production is allowed to cut loose, give the riffs a little bit more heft, but then Pete Robertson takes over and gives a lot of the rougher guitar timbres blending in with the synths a little bit more of a jangling indie rock presence. Or you get a cut like Vapor that's allowed to get even more rough around the edges and kind of works. But remember when I highlighted how the debut really wanted the writing to do some of the heavy lifting? Yeah, that's back here as well. And while I would argue like there are some good moments like the insecurity behind the laziness of Slacker, or how well she delves into her own lesbian relationship, I'm not sure there's enough to overlook some underwhelming vocals, or how most of these hooks do not have much muscle or sticking power for me. This album got a lot of buzz for having some cutesy/graphic juxtapositions inspired by Jennifer's Body, and man, that movie's had an influential shelf life for younger demos. But for me, the edge doesn't hit as starkly as you would hope, and it leaves me thinking that it'll have more resonance for its teenage target audience than anyone else who's heard more. 6 out of 10. Again, got its moments, but not much that goes beyond. Next up from Squid, Bright Green Field.
Memories are so unnatural. I am my own narrator.
You know, there's a part of me that wants to be cynical. Actually, scratch that. The part of me that is cynical about music in 2021 can't help but see the rise of a certain stripe of layered, post-punk, post-hardcore experimental rock that's cribbing from Slint and Ernest and think, yeah, this is critic bait. And I don't mean to disparage acts like Black Midi or Black Country New Road, might slip really from into this category too, because I am among the folks for which this really works. But it's also one of those cases where I want to be conscious of exactly how much I like this because of marveling at the intricacy of the construction or the writing versus how much of an actual sustained emotional core that'll actually have to stick with me longer. So Squid really is a prime test for this. Hailing from the UK, the most obvious thing to note here is just how much this band takes from the horn-accented, jittery complexity and rams it through with talking heads worship with a smattering of aught and parquet quartz. The latter coming through with a more locked-in commitment to the steady rhythm section that really does make me think Squid might wind up being the most accessible that are coming out of this scene, especially in the UK right now. But for as impeccably polished and balanced as this is, with a lot of the coursing grooves and the tightly balanced synths, guitars, and horns bucking in for melodic focus, I've criticized Dan Carey before, but his production really does stand out here. But what this reminds me of probably the most is Aught's 2015 album, Sun Coming Down, especially in a lot of the themes of being trapped within these incomprehensible, oppressive systems and the utterly warped break it'll cause for a discerning mind that sees all of it, expanding off of the surrealist, nightmarish themes of two Anna Kavan stories, less Kafkaesque and more focusing on the expanse itself that will swallow you. But you know, like that album, there is some of that same dark humor that prevents the sound from becoming more of a slog, which can be an issue in this brand of post-punk, as well as enough keen self-awareness to keep things mostly populist. Narrator focuses on someone so aggressively framing himself as the main character that he ignores the woman who is caught up in even more oppressive systems in favor of his projections upon her, and that snaps into even sharper focus on Peel Street. That being said, this is an album that seems to distrust any sort of collective action, finding a lot more intensity in the manic expression of being free, however and wherever. Kind of ironic for a band that is so controlled and in sync with each other in the same, but that also means it doesn't quite have the same dramatic arc as Black Country New Road, or some of the personal touches of Really From, or just going outright bonkers as Black Midi, or even the purest moments of ecstasy that Aught had previously. And when you couple it with the influences feeling so obvious, look, I still like this a fair bit, but I am cooler on it than most. Solid 7 out of 10, definitely good in the lane. The next album will probably be great. Next up from Wreche, All My Dreams Came True. Okay, so imagine a black metal album where you swap out the guitars for pianos. And if that sounds a little nuts, that was my first impression upon hearing about this sophomore album from this Oakland act. So to get a handle, I had to check out the 2017 debut, and yeah, that's exactly what it is. And let me start off by saying that just as a one-off anomaly, on a compositional level, it is intriguing. The piano work is probably a lot closer to jazz in order to support a well-balanced groove section and the distinctive distant howls of our frontman. And even if some of the melodies were kind of good, I found myself wondering if the keyboards could create a little bit more atmosphere or bite. That distortion is a key element to a lot of black metal sound and appeal, so I really had to wonder if they would expand upon that sound or really effectively capture it, or whether or not it'd just be a one-off gimmick. And this, well, you know what, it's promising, but it's kind of haphazard. And there's a part of me still not entirely convinced that this is elevating beyond its central instrumental conceit. In order to build a little bit more dramatic swell and texture, they brought in some symphonic elements, both choral and what sounds like these contorted synth strings interwoven in to support the shredded vocals and the absolutely wild percussion. And I won't deny that it further contributes to the haunted elegance of a lot of these compositions, even before they tack on some howling, extremely glitchy synth passages. But there's still a part of me that is absolutely convinced this album needs a bass line or effective synth bass or of some variety to add a little bit more groove, ramp up the ominous punishment that's being delivered, or maybe just a little bit more low-end variation to help diversify the melodies, especially on an album that does run fairly long song to song with so much manic melodic complexity. But I will say I think the writing's pretty good, definitely impressionistic and drilling into some pretty standard "we are all damned amidst a modern uncaring world and religion is gonna fail us all," even if our protagonist manages to find some delirious, sneering comfort in knowing the truth about faith, some form of bleak hidden knowledge. But the further they go, the less satisfaction they find in it, the gut-churning consequence of all those dreams actually coming true if there's nothing that's going to replace them. It's the underside of success in an unjust world, especially comparison with everyone else, where by the end they're seeking whatever scrap of frail beauty to offset the numbness, where to their credit the piano-driven approach captures a lot of that haunted elegance remarkably well, even that sense of panic. And yet, while I do think this is a more fully formed and dynamic project than the debut, there shows a lot of promise here, and again, the previous album felt more like a pilot to see if the idea could even work. I think a little more expansion is needed to make this truly great, so solid 7 out of 10. Definitely going to keep my eyes on this one. Next up, from Sons of Kemet, Black to the Future. So the last time I reviewed Sons of Kemet, it was more freeform when I was on vacation in the UK in 2018. I would be completely understanding of anyone who wanted me to expand my thoughts on them from there, or at least give me the chance to provide them in a more organized manner. Because Sons of Kemet were certainly intriguing in their socially conscious balance of African polyrhythms and textured percussion with jazz, but I had some quibbles with the drum mixing, and despite the very charged lyricism, how quickly the album could slip into the background for me. But again, I also know some of this comes from me being someone who will gravitate more towards melody than the frankly excellent drum work here. I appreciate the quality, I just felt a little distant from it. And again, I didn't dislike what I heard on that last album, so I really wanted to give this one a lot more thought, some closer examination, and it feels a little like a lateral move. Don't get me wrong, it's still really good. The drum work is textured, much better blended, while still feeling very organic. The horns are more diverse, and we actually get some distinctive solos there. When we do get spoken word raps, they are universally excellent, and balancing out just how black people have found their core of righteous power against both active and systemic oppression, some of which highlights them being pushed so far to the brink with no quarter given, means that they've got really no qualms responding in fair kind, which is almost a relief to them, but also just how much they want to be left alone, to live and find some peace. Both in the opener and closer with Joshua Iadon, they're striking as all hell, and that's about as much as I can really add. Now, some of this is me wishing for a more defined low-end groove section again beyond the percussion and the tuba, but the larger issue here might be with some of the best moments, especially when there's any sense of vocals. Because the writing is literally so good, it makes me wish there was more of it across the album. It stands out so starkly that even if there are more showy horn solos, they don't quite hit with the same urgency or impact in contrast. Granted, this album also brings in some slower Caribbean-inspired rhythms and melodies on cuts like Think of Home or For the Culture, and they don't quite have the same emotive pull for me, but I can't really knock the album for that because this is so obviously not made for me, and I expect the target audience will get a lot more homespun comfort for it, even if I think a few more songs and lyrics interspersed throughout the back half of the album might help some of the individual cuts stand out a little bit more. Ergo for me, solid 7 out of 10, but I am comfortable acknowledging that this is so much outside my regular wheelhouse, and if you're a lot more into Afrobeat and experimental jazz, you'll probably get more from it. In that case, give it a chance. Check it out. Next up, from Lord Huron, Long Lost. Okay, full disclosure, I was planning on covering the newest Panopticon album in this slot, but since it normally takes a while for Austin Lund's lyrics to wind up online, I'm now stuck with Lord Huron? Now, to my credit, I briefly mentioned them before back in 2017 when their song The Night We Met nabbed a chart position thanks to its inclusion in 13 Reasons Why. But in going through their catalog at large, well, outside of being broadly familiar with a few songs like Ends of the Earth thanks to a few too many TV inclusions, why do I now get the feeling that I'm discussing an act on the folkier side of commercial core? They certainly came out of that wave in the early 2010s from the very obvious cribbing of the intersection of Mumford & Sons and Fleet Foxes, and while I can admire some surprisingly good compositional instincts if you're paying attention, there was a real lack of refinement and subtlety in the writing and production around it, to say nothing of some rather underwhelming vocals, and none of it really gripped me over the course of their back catalog, especially when they followed in Mumford & Sons' path and went more indie rock, complete with some truly egregious production inconsistencies on that last album. And now that we're here, well, I will say this. I certainly get why a number of critics are absolutely losing it over this album, given that Lord Huron have once again followed the pack and hopped on the retro singer-songwriter craze, this time expanding some of their jangling Western influences into making something between the Baroque pop of the 1960s and more of the country-politan sound of the early 70s, complete with a lot of oversaturation and reverb to make it sound more modern and applicable to this band, and even with some voiceover snippets that sound like they were imported from a cheap radio show. So, in a word, this is an album that is shamelessly pandering to any of the retro fetishists with this sound. But again, as someone who likes this sound, while I will agree it is a more interesting tone for Lord Huron, I just don't think it's all that well executed. The production, again, remains the biggest problem. It's so blown out and hazy, the vocals push midway back into this cloud when they're not at the very front, where it might not even surprise you that they end the album with an extended ambient piece that's actually pretty good, and it might lead to some impressive texture, but it can only disguise underwhelming vocals or compositions for so long here. And yeah, I include the writing in that. Said radio show features a fictional singer-songwriter making plenty of lovelorn songs only to come to the slow and painful realization that said relationship, it was probably doomed for all the right reasons, as both lifelong partners seem at best like they're losing interest in each other, and at worst, kind of unfaithful. But this is where that more earnest vintage presentation that is completely unable to sell any sense of darkness and a lack of greater lyrical detail leaves me scrabbling for more to elevate this beyond imitation of past sounds, especially as nobody here seems all that likable, and the album ends on the mantra, what does it all mean if it all means nothing? And that places the album in a bit of an odd spot. Outside of the relationship songs, it's clearly trying to place a comment on its own weight and the weight of history and carry itself with so much pomp and circumstance, but the stories being painted don't really sell it beyond 20 long years, or funnily enough, that ambient piece at the very end, which kind of fits the abstract swell remarkably effectively. I don't know, this is an album that feels like it's trying to write itself into a history that's long passed it by, trying to rest on legacy that it never built. The best retro pastiches either take old sounds in a cool new direction, that's your Kyle Craft, or they use them to comment on the modern world by painting with them, which even if I don't really like her material, that is something Lana Del Rey can mostly pull off. This feels like the latter, but with ideas that feel severely undercooked. The sound is certainly the most agreeable it's ever been. I'll give them points for this probably being their best album. And if you don't have a collection of vinyl from that era so you know what the original sounds like, I can see some people being impressed. But I have that collection of vinyl, and I'm just not impressed. 6 out of 10, I know when this was done better. Next up from St. Vincent, Daddy's Home. Speaking of retro, I've been worried about this album since the lead-off singles left me with a really weird vibe where I was left hoping the album would give them more context, especially as St. Vincent was going into retro 70s glam as well. But unlike Lord Huron, St. Vincent has had a pretty impressive run of excellence across the 2010s. That gave me expectations. And that kind of sucks, because this is the sort of album for which I understand the appeal, I think I get what it's trying to do, but on a textural level, it just loses me, and that feels incredibly frustrating. I want to like this more. Now, a big part of this I'm going to blame on Jack Antonoff. Maybe he thought that his work with Lana Del Rey equipped him for this sort of mid-70s funk, glam, soft rock fusion with a lot of goopy dollops of phasing psychedelia, but not all retro tones work in the same way, and a lot of his production touches come across as really stiff and over-arranged, trying to synthesize the chaotic vibe when it's not coming naturally. Now granted, I place some of this on Annie Clark as well, because for as much as she clearly idolizes David Bowie and Prince, and they were not immune to this sort of experimental misfire as well, but they were a hell of a lot more convincingly languid and loose than she can convincingly sell. And yeah, I include her attempts to get more soulful or raw on this album too. And yes, I get the undercurrent of hazy, drugged out New York City anxiety. It's part of the point, and Annie Clark has no problem playing in the uncanny valley, but this is an album that wants to hone in on a human experience that it kind of has some trouble quantifying, and this is where we need to touch on the content, specifically the two interweaving arcs. The return of her father from prison, where he went for stock manipulation, which has led to some messiness with music journalists probing into this territory, and how she increasingly wants to buck against feminine expectations placed upon her. Cause hell, all she wants to do is carouse and fuck freely and not have kids, embrace all the willful irresponsibility, the roots of which you could probably place at the feet of being confronted with a returning father figure for which she seems to have some issues, but also embracing plenty of the parallels. There's emotional complexity there. And again, the struggle between bucking against traditional feminine expectations, it's been a theme in St. Vincent's work since the very beginning. It's what makes albums like Strange Mercy so uncomfortable, so powerful, but this scene feels a lot closer to home for her, and I don't think she was prepared to deal with the added complexities in making her story more personal. The conversation around prison, that's probably where the tension is most apparent, because St. Vincent will reference the indignities of mass incarceration, and then she will reference a lot of black artists in both her own writing and the sound of the album, and look, I don't know, it just feels a little off to draw a parallel between systemic injustice and her father's own white-collar crimes in the service of capitalism, especially when she still has a sense of privilege that she hasn't quite contextualized that lets her reference calling the cops multiple times across this album as a part of her own recklessness, and that can lead to some cognitive dissonance when she's trying to skate by in a patriarchal system. And her words find the balance between surviving and dignity, but factoring in an attempted historical parallel with the 70s as well, along with commentary on the modern day, it feels even more confused, really undercooked. If this album had stuck with a smaller, more personal scope, it probably would have been a lot more effective, especially as St. Vincent still has a real knack for probing into fractured and flawed humanity, including her own, a lot more so than historical polls that kind of feel like a reach. And look, as much as I can point to examples of, let's say, Tune Yard's 2018 album, or parts of Sam Fender's debut, and highlight how writing about privilege from this sort of point of view is often kind of messy, incoherent, hasn't made for a lot of great art, I think my larger issue is that if I felt this came together in themes or sound, I'd be more forgiving of the awkwardness, because again, there's a seed of an interesting emotional crisis point and parallel here, but if you were expecting hooks to rival her best in the 2010s, this album is gonna leave you wanting, and I just don't think it comes together as a whole. It doesn't really coalesce into more. For me, it's a solid 6 out of 10. Interesting experiment, doesn't stick the landing, but if you can look more into the sound, you can look past the messiness, you'll probably like it more. I know I'm on the outside looking in with this one. Next up from Alan Jackson, Where Have You Gone?
The more I think, you only get a minute, better live while you're in it, 'cause it's gone in a blink.
The The funny thing with any Alan Jackson review is that even though I'm overjoyed that we got a new album from him, a behemoth of a thing that was 6 years in the making with 21 songs, you also know pretty much exactly what you're going to get from this guy. The sort of deeply rooted, neo-traditional country with rich, robust arrangements that go down amazingly smooth, with every peal of pedal steel and fiddle, only accentuated with Alan Jackson's voice, which has only picked up more deep richness and body with age, even if you can tell that he's been steadily slowing down with time. And here's the thing. I'm a really big Alan Jackson fan, but I also know across his career, he's more known for fantastic singles runs over consistently good albums. So even if there's a few scattered exceptions, I do kind of question the choice to go for broke for so long on this album, especially as he's got one remarkably agreeable sound that he doesn't tend to vary all that much. Now this is alleviated by the fact that his choice of instrumental tones and his production with Keith Stegall remain impeccable, and he likes giving his band a little bit more space to breathe, and that's certainly pleasant. And you can tell he has long stopped caring about chasing the big single. And you know what? If there's one thing I really appreciate about this album, it's how well it actually fits his age. Alan Jackson's in his early 60s, and to be fair, he's always made music like he's the most old and mature guy in the room, even on his party songs. A lot of people forget that even on Chattahoochee, when the girl isn't ready, they go get burgers and ice cream instead. And you know, for a more cynical audience, it has made his material either really corny or kind of mawkishly sentimental. But I don't know, there's a lived-in, unpretentious nature to a lot of his writing and a sense of detail that comes with a lot of self-awareness. And by now, he's got nothing left to prove. And while it's absolutely a lot more traditionalist and conservative, it's often so tastefully earnest and empathetic, it's really hard to dislike, especially as he is now in the position not have to care so much about the industry, which is why it's a little bit exasperating when he still does his bring in country music back songs, where after a really solid opening title track, we get Back, which is probably the most openly regressive track on the album and absolutely the worst. Country never left Alan, you just have to look a little bit harder to get to it, and hell, even now in Nashville, the mainstream sounds that he likes, they've got momentum. Now the other problem is that, as comfortable of a listen as this is, it does run long, courtesy of some awkward pacing choices, and it can kind of feel a little redundant in spots. He has multiple songs dedicated to his daughters for their own wedding days, and I definitely wish there were more storytelling songs like The Boot that could add a little bit more to the sprawl of this thing. But at the end of the day, this album might be custom built for your parents if they're a little bit older, but hell, they need great music too, and I'm treating this very much in the same way I treated Reba McEntire's album from 2019 that was also really great. At this point in their careers, they don't need to be this great, but I'm kind of thrilled that they are. Light 8 out of 10, you'll want to check it out. And finally, from Olivia Rodrigo, Sour.
About me. 'Cause you said forever, now I drive alone past your street.
There was a part of me that was kind of shocked by just how much praise Sour was getting from mainstream and independent critics, but that part of me ebbed back in record time. Of course the critics like this. Pop with traces of a rock edge, reasonably sharp writing behind someone with legit charisma and singing chops, but also commercially huge so you can punch in your Poptimus card and maintain your indie cred. I have been down this road many times before. Not saying I disagree, yet, but I'm also canny enough to see that when the industry has a bona fide star coming off of Disney and then can give them the sort of budget and exposure that so many of Olivia Rodrigo's peers would kill to have, I call it like I see it. And what I'm saying is that while I've liked a lot of her singles thus far, I actually had some fairly low expectations for this, and I was conscious of where the hype was actually rooted, and yeah, you know what? It's pretty good for what it is. And I don't mean that as a backhanded compliment either. Sour feels very Gen Z high school all the way down. And presuming you can suspend your disbelief and recognize everything the average high schooler does not have in order to make an album like this, there's a lot in terms of texture and writing style, and even the production that can feel authentic to that experience. And yet it's probably not a great thing to start here when I can hear the very obvious points of influence, Taylor Swift being the biggest, but in reality, this brand of teen pop with just just a hint of an edge. It's been a thing now for about 20 years. And I know this because I grew up in the last major wave of it in the 2000s, with pop starlets like Pink and Hilary Duff, Avril Lavigne, and especially the pop rock and emo boom of that decade laid a lot of that template, especially Paramore. And as I mentioned in that last episode of Billboard Breakdown, the parallels melodically might even be a little bit too close in some spots if you know what to expect. Hell, a couple days ago I found an unofficial mashup of Good For You and Misery Business, and not only does it make complete sense and could actually work in the context of the album with Haley playing the bad guy, it might be the best thing associated with either artist in years. Now, I have seen some criticism that this album can feel kind of one-dimensional in its teenage breakup storytelling, but I'm actually going to give it a pass here because A, it's actually pretty well told with the detail and surprising nuance in order to flesh it out, especially on cuts like Enough For You, and B, if you're a teenager, this sort of melodrama would really consume your life in microcosm anyway. This is an album that thrives off of creating realistic immersion with an emotional logic as its through line, and I will give Olivia Rodrigo points in finding some notes of maturity in acknowledging her own culpability in all of this, and then to step away and move on by the end on Hope You're Okay. Where I have a lot less patience is in some of the execution. Thank God this album is a quick half hour, because it is ballad heavy with some pretty basic underlying compositions. And when it tries to rock a little harder, it's got nowhere close to the texture or intensity to sell it all that well. And no, not just compared to the 2000s. We can look at all the teenagers making heavier music right goddamn now just outside the mainstream, and that's not even touching on the very obvious touches of Billie Eilish on this project, who frankly is a little better. I do have to wonder if some of this is a Disney Act issue, that Olivia Rodrigo can't sound too raw or all that intense, or that her rock elements have to be desaturated, kind of clunky, the very obvious sounds of a major label studio trying to fake the DIY that can't quite nail the rawness. We heard a lot of this in the 90s and 2000s, and I kind of wish there was a better balance in between the edge and the glossier pop cuts. This album is a little bit too tasteful to go for broken either. That being said, Driver's License is a pretty great single. Good For You in any incarnation only gets stronger with every listen. Deja Vu, Exist, and even if nothing else on the album gets close to that level for me, I had my anthems in the 2000s. I hear that lineage of relatability. That's where this album will have its staying power. 7 out of 10 for me, but kids, have fun. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Man, I need to really cut down on these. These are starting to run really long, and it's going to be a pain in the ass to edit. Anyway, beyond that, thank you all for watching. If you got any comments, please leave them down there below. I'm sure I said something to piss you off. Look on the St. Vincent review for that. But outside of that, if there's any of you guys who have not subscribed, only about half of you have, I'd be appreciating to have you on board. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting the channel or get albums onto my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated to join. It's tough times out there, but the option is available. Until then, though, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.